Shaylee, and this is lesson number 3 for the Learning Foundation Paper Piecing segment. Today we are doing a very quick block, however it is larger than what we've been working on. It's this Flying Geese heart block, and if you haven't yet, you can click on the link below. It'll take you to my blog, and there is a link that says click here, and you can download the pattern for free. We're doing this in a slightly larger size than the previous 2 segments so that we can practice a few things. Number 1 is assembling segments that span more than 1 page. This is something that's very common in foundation paper piecing. Number 2, we're going to be adding sections that are angled. The previous section that we did was split down the middle. This time it is split side to side. We are also going to be working with the difficulties of just piecing larger blocks. Sometimes that's a little more difficult for some people, and sometimes smaller is a little bit more difficult for people. So you may be like me and be really excited that this is a larger block. We're also going to discuss resizing patterns and dealing with the potential bulk at some of the seams that happen when patterns get a little more complicated. So let's get going. First, if you haven't yet, check out the previous 2 lessons. There should be a link up above, a little white bar. Click that and it'll take you to the first lesson. Once you have downloaded the pattern from my blog, the first thing you're going to do is print your pattern and make sure that you've removed the margins. This is super important when you have sections that span more than 1 page. So if you print without margins, it's going to look like this. It's going to go really close to the edge of the paper. That's exactly what you want. If you don't know how to print without margins, I mentioned that in video number 2. Link should be right there. Print the pattern, make sure you don't have any margins, and then make sure you're printing at 100%. So before you get going, grab some tape or glue, because that is how we're going to assemble our pieces of paper together so that we can piece with them. So what I do is I lay the pieces of paper out in order, or if I am doing a very large pattern and there's a lot of pieces, I will cherry pick through the pile and pick the pieces that, so let's say I'm looking for all the B's. So I'll pull out the 3 pieces of paper that have B and then get ready to assemble it that way. This one is 4 pages, so we'll go ahead and just lay it out so you can kind of see the whole thing. I don't know if you can see it with the camera angle the way it is. The next step is going to be trim the piece of paper that we're going to set on top of the other. So right now, if I were to have these flat on the table, this is the piece of paper that's going to go on top. So we're going to trim off this white line so that we can see the other piece of paper below it. There is no real rhyme or reason to which one goes on top, so just pick one and make sure that you only trim one. If you trim both pieces of paper, it makes it super, super, super difficult to try and assemble and tape together, because the likelihood is that you'll accidentally split it just a little bit, which is really annoying, and it picks up a lot of thread, which is not helpful. Once I've done that, I can carefully line up. You'll want to not look at just one line. Check all your different lines, make sure everything looks nice and straight. It's going to come pretty darn close to lining up exactly on the dotted line. And then you can either add a little bit of glue and use your iron and iron it. Sometimes I do that if I can't find my tape. Today I was good and I dug out my see-through tape. When you tape, make sure you're taping on the section, not on the piece of paper that you're going to cut off. So I've done that. It's kind of annoying. Now you can do this one of 2 ways. You can go ahead and assemble all 4 pieces of paper completely together and then cut it, or you can cut off section B. I am working on a cardboard table and I don't always have as much room as I want. So I go ahead and just cut off section B. I'm going to take the little piece and lay it on top of the big one. So I'm going to cut along the dotted line here. And then I'm going to do the same thing with this piece of paper. I'm going to go ahead and separate the two. All right, I will cut along the dotted line. And I will say, sometimes you'll get a pattern that doesn't have a dotted line. I know some of my first patterns, I hadn't quite figured out how to do that and get it all lined up right. So some patterns do not have the dotted line. Just cut as close as possible to the line and then line it up. It takes a little bit of extra time, but it really does work. I've been doing it that way for a very long time before I started making patterns to sell. If you are unable to remove the margins from your paper, assembling everything's going to take just a couple extra steps. What you're going to do is you're going to take a pencil or a pen, and you're going to take a ruler, and you're going to carefully extend every line that comes close to the edge of the paper all the way off the paper. So let's say this one that I haven't cut yet has had a margin cut off. So what I'm going to do is draw along the lines, just extend those lines out. You should be able to now use the lines that extend all the way to the edge of the paper to line everything up. What you're doing is you're essentially filling in the gap that the printer has cut off. By doing it before you cut anything or assemble anything makes it a lot easier, because you'll be able to match things better. And it's super important that you don't accidentally get a little crooked with your lines. Otherwise, this doesn't help. Once you have finished assembling one entire section, you can do what you normally do and trim it up roughly, not exactly to your dotted line. In this particular one, I went ahead and added another B to. It's not because it needs pieced separately. It is so that when you were cutting and assembling, you would be able to tell where this corner piece would go. So it was a little less like a puzzle and more just matching. So you're only going to be sewing and piecing along the solid lines here. The dotted lines that extend through the 1/4 inch seam were just your piecing line, or your taping lines. All right, there it is. I've got both of my sections ready to be pieced. I know that some people prefer being able to print and just cut and go. However, I believe that fidgeting a little bit to get the paper lined up correctly is a lot easier and has more accurate results in the end than when you have to straight pin more sections together. So for instance, if I had tried to do this one so that it only fit on one piece of paper, or that each section fit on one piece of paper and didn't span any sections, it probably would be 4 pieces, or I wouldn't have been able to print it as 12 inch. It's sometimes irritating, but it really is helpful to learn this skill. Now go ahead and piece each section, and this is the opportune time to practice piecing with large sections. If you're joining the quilt along for a cause, all the blocks are 15 inches, and it does take a little bit of practice to get the hang of working with larger pieces. Personally, I prefer larger blocks because it means that I can have a lot more detail and a lot less fidgeting. One tip I do have is to always rotate and sew in a way that you're sewing the largest part of the paper hanging away from the throat of your machine. Now, I use a Janome Memory Craft 7700, and it's like an 11-inch throat, so it's very large. I'm able to piece very easily any direction that I want, but I did start out using a Walmart tiny little brother. So you can paper piece on just about any machine. You just have to kind of be aware as you go to lay the paper in that you may need to rotate. For instance, I'm about to unfold and sew this piece of paper. So if I had done it this way, oops, I dropped it. If I'd done it this way, I would be opening this up, and then I'd have to fight this paper through the throat. By rotating and sewing this way, when I open it up and feed it in, this all hangs out just like you would worry about when you're sewing normally. We've already discussed connecting two sections. However, this one is at a bit of an angle, so this can make it more difficult. Your natural inclination is to line up the edges of your paper, like so. However, this does not actually work when sections are not perfectly straight, such as with the diagonal seams here. Again, you're going to take straight pins. You're going to poke it through the corners. And you're also going to want to make sure you stick a straight pin right here where the two sections need to match exactly. Stick pins through every few inches, like so. So then I will run my finger along and slightly separate them. A line of glue. One of the questions you will undoubtedly have is, when should I remove the paper? That depends on the quilter. Some quilters like to remove the paper each block as they go. That way they can trim it up exactly, and then they use their normal 1/4 inch foot and piece all the blocks together. If you're doing an intricate quilt where all of the blocks need to be exactly matched and you need to leave the paper on, then that method probably won't work for you. Some quilters believe that the block is most stable while still attached to the paper. Because of the way foundation paper piecing works, you end up sometimes with bias running in different directions. So the more you're going to handle the block, the better it is to go ahead and leave it on the paper. A lot of people will leave the paper on until everything is sewn in all the way. So when this has been, say I'm going to put sashing around this. Once I've done the sashing all the way around, it's probably safe to remove the paper. Some quilters will go ahead and leave it until the entire quilt top is done, and they will remove the paper as the last step before they quilt it or send it off to their long armor. Personally, I do something in between the two. I leave the paper on the actual block, but I remove the paper here along the seam. If you have a lot of sections that are going to go together, this will be a helpful tip, because once you start sewing sections together, it becomes even more difficult to try and get, say I already sewed here, it's very difficult to try and get that paper that's been sewn down out. So I go ahead and remove it from here. The bad thing about doing this is you have to be aware, now this paper is not very well attached. You can actually see right here, my B3 section is already lifting. So I run the risk of losing my points or losing the lines that I'm going to need if I was trying to pin this to another section. So you're going to have to experiment a little bit to find the right method that works for you. Removing that seam can help reduce the bulk of an area, especially if you've got a lot of tiny sections that are going to be pieced together at one spot, which is the next question I often hear. How do I reduce bulk in my quilt or my foundation paper piecing blocks? In my opinion, there aren't too many options for reducing bulk if the pattern is by nature bulky. If you have ever downloaded my scarecrow pattern, you know sometimes it's bulky. It just, if you look at the little fingers on the scarecrow pattern, it's a slightly bulky pattern. Some patterns are just going to be bulky by nature. If it's a struggle for you, you can try enlarging the pattern, or you'll start to spot areas that are probably going to be bulky and you can avoid those kinds of patterns. To reduce it, if you have accidentally gotten yourself into a bulky pattern, you can trim your seam. So right here, you could trim this down to 1/8 of an inch. However, if you do that, you're likely reducing the strength of your quilt top in that area. It would be more likely to fray and fall apart. You can try simplifying a pattern, which most pattern makers are not going to be offended by. For instance, the scarecrow pattern, if you don't like the straw or it's too bulky for you, you can either completely remove the fingers and just sew one large background section there, or you could maybe skip every other finger and combine it with the next section. You'll have to really mark up the pattern so you don't accidentally goof and sew the wrong thing in the wrong place, but you can easily adjust some of the bulkier patterns. The final option, to me, the best option, is to try enlarging the pattern. Adjusting the size of the pattern is my final talking point for this video. Resizing a pattern at home requires two things primarily: math and critical thinking skills. First, you have to decide what size your pattern finishes to versus what size you want it to be. And then you'll need to decide if you can actually do that at home, or if you're going to need to go to Staples or a copy store of some sort. Let's say we're resizing this 12-inch pattern down to a 6-inch pattern. Most printers will be able to do that with no problem. Downsizing is easy to do at home. To do the math, you're going to take the desired size, so 6 inches, and divide it by the original size of 12 inches, and you're going to get 0.5. You're going to multiply this times 100, which comes out to be 50%. So when you go to print, you can print it at 50% and it will come out to be a 6-inch pattern. Just remember, your 1/4 inch seams are no longer a 1/4 inch, so you're going to need to use a ruler and pay attention when you're cutting. Now, something to keep in mind, if you shrink this particular pattern down to 50%, you're still going to have to piece your sections. Your computer didn't split the sections, I did. It's not going to skip the hassle of potentially taping pieces together. You'll have tinier versions of the sections to put together, but you'll still have to do the taping. Let's say you want your pattern to do the opposite. You want this 12-inch pattern to print at 24 inches. You're going to need the help of a copy machine or your local print shop. You can use a standard copy machine. If you work in an office and they let you use copy machines, you'll be able to use that copy machine. I know our local library has a copy machine that you can go in and use, but the majority of home printers will not enlarge an image the correct way. What they do is they blow up one piece of paper and then keep it on that same piece of paper. You need something that's going to be smart enough to understand that if it no longer fits on one page, it needs broken into several different pages. What you're going to do is the same math. You're going to divide the number that you want, the size that you want, divided by the original size. So 24 divided by the original 12-inch size, and then you're going to multiply it by 100, and you're going to need to print at 200%. You can, if you can't do it at home, print your original pattern at 100%, take those hard copy pages into the library or the print shop or whatever, and tell them that you need it printed to 200%. The copy machine software will automatically print that onto several different pages. So you're going to have even more piecing to do, and most likely it will not include the cutting line, but it is totally doable. It just takes a couple extra minutes to get it all assembled. Let's do a more difficult math equation, since both of those were very easy. Let's say you have purchased a 22-inch pattern and you need it to fit into a 15-inch block. So we're going to take 15, which is the desired block size, divide it by 22, the original size, multiply it times 100, and we'll get 68.18181818%. Round that up to 69%, that's what I would do, so that it finishes just a hair too big instead of a hair too small. If it's ever so slightly too big, you can always trim it. And if it's ever so slightly too small, you're kind of out of luck. That's it. That is foundation paper piecing. The only thing that we didn't cover is if you are piecing something that's more than 2 sections, but it's the same thing. For mine, let's say there was a C section that spans across the top of this heart. It's the same thing. You'll assemble all your sections, and then in order, you'll piece A to B, then you'll iron it, and then you'll piece AB to section C. It really is super simple, and you don't need to practice it to be able to manage it. Let me know if you guys have any more questions. I would love to do some more videos if they are helpful for you. Enjoy foundation paper piecing.